You're a true scientist.
Yeah, right there.
She gave you one.
Do you have one?
I have my. All right, let's call it to order. It's 10 minutes to 11. It's the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee meeting for Tuesday, March 3rd. Announcements: the meeting is being audio and visual recorded. And please silence your cell phones or any other electronic devices so they don't interrupt the meeting. First up, we have the approval of the minutes. We'll start with February 12th, and then we also have February 18th. On the 12th, I have an edit. I was not stating that the data was in tubular form, that it was in tabular form. Although, being a child of the 80s, I could have said tubular.
Spell check didn't work again? It worked fine. It spelled the word right. It was just the wrong word.
Are you sure, Mary?
That happens to me a lot. I like that.
And then I think under item, that was item A, the second paragraph. And item B, the first paragraph, the RFP will not be available for public comment. I think that was the correct statement.
Correct.
Yeah. Did anyone else have edits or comments on the minutes from the 12th? All right, I'll hear a motion to approve.
So move.
Fritz, second? Second. Thank you, Gary. And all those in favor, we need to count off. Fritz?
Fritz McClure, yes.
Mary Longacre, yes?
Sarah Boyce. I wasn't here, so
You can
yes,
abstain,
I can
if you
abstain.
want.
Okay. Abstain.
Jen Carberg, yes.
Peter Brace, yes.
Thank you. And Ian, we're just approving the minutes of the February 12th meeting.
Thank you.
Ian Golding.
And Gary, thank you, Gary, I apologize.
Sorry, I'm late.
Good morning.
Good morning. Ian Golding, yes.
Thank you, Ian. So that is 6 in favor, 1 abstention, and 2 absent. All right, the minutes of February 18th. I did not have any edits. Did anyone else have comments or edits on those?
No changes.
If no one has comments, then we can entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Peter, and a second?
Second.
Fritz, second. All those in favor, again, we'll count off Fritz.
Fritz McClure, yes.
Ian Golding, aye.
Mary Longacre, yes?
Sarah Boyce, yes.
Jen Carberg, yes.
Peter Brace, yes.
And Gary?
Yes.
Thank you, Gary. That's unanimous approval. All right, so committee discussion. Do we have ideas for new goals? We had gone through the goals that we had set up at the beginning of our meetings last fall, sort of as a 6-month milestone check. We were happy with our accomplishments and thought that we might consider new goals, whether 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever time frame. If anyone has something to suggest. It's not a requirement, it's just something we wanted to discuss. All right, no discussion necessary or noticed, so we can move on to the next agenda item. And that is continuing discussion on recommendation to the select board. Vince has a draft, is that
Yep,
on the screen in a minute? Yeah. Has everybody had a chance to read the draft? Do we need a minute to read it now? Does anyone have any comments or discussion? Peter?
Just some clerical stuff, and then, so we're in the bold there in the first paragraph. Shouldn't it say all town departments, boards, commissions, and committees? Because you want to cover
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
right at the beginning, and then after, on the next line, any service provider, contract engineers, and consultants. After the word consultants, you need the word need in there.
Need to be aware. Yeah.
Say that again,
Peter, I'm sorry.
After the word consultants, you need the word need.
I would disagree with that because this is a directive and says everybody to be aware of and use the best, as opposed to everybody needs to be aware of it. To me, that softens the language. I don't know.
I think it's
Any
pretty-
discussion?
I think the whole thing is pretty right there in your face. I just think it reads better, that's all. But
Where's the verb?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's the verb for that sentence?
Exactly.
Yeah.
To be aware.
You could
That's
I mean,
not
you could- yeah.
active.
You could say must be aware.
Shall be aware.
Yeah.
Should.
Yeah, thou shalt.
Thou
Thou
shalt
shalt be aware.
Sounds like a lawyer.
make a command.
I've been around Fritz too long.
Needs.
But is the actual
Needs is
sentence
much
that is the actual sentence that also I just think that before we ever use the acronym CRAC, we have to define it and also use the in front of it, just because otherwise. Anyway, but if we say if the actual verb is the crack committee poses the following recommendation, you know what I mean, or they recommend, or we recommend, or is just the bold part the?
I think
Do you know what I mean? Like, should we put the part about the committee in bold? I mean, if it means anything.
the statement we're recommending is bold in the quotes, and I agree there's a little fuzziness. I think we're recommending that the select board issue that statement. We're not recommending that statement without,
Right, okay.
maybe that's the verb that we're missing.
Well, to follow up on Peter's point, shall is grammatically incorrect, in fact, because it's the first person singular of to be. So it would be will be aware. And I think needs to be aware is personally, I like the way that sounds.
Need be aware.
Yeah.
Need be aware, yeah.
We can make that edit. Yeah.
And Vince, can you put boards after town departments? Because we're pointing this at the planning board, right, and other boards, right?
Well, every single one of them, yeah.
Yeah.
But I like your idea of adding the commissions and committees.
Just don't want to leave very much into, don't want to leave too much to interpretation. And I just had a couple of other little things, like before the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, you should have the word the. And before the Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study, the. I don't know, maybe not, but, and then down like maybe on the fifth line, way over on the right,
Sorry, just hang on one sec, Pete.
sure.
So first one you said was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Where's that?
Under the table.
Under the table, thank you.
Sorry, yeah, the table. Down below. Second paragraph, Vince. Oh, there too, yeah.
And what was the second one there, Pete?
The before the statistical analysis of historical extreme water levels was second line right there, yep.
Can I make a recommendation that we save the grammatical stuff that you could just send to Vince? Because I have a few of
Okay.
those too, but that we use this time to talk about the content.
All right, well, I get just one more, that's all. On the fifth line over on the right, you say the differs, and I think you mean the difference, right?
Or this differs,
This differs.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
4 down from
Next sentence up and then over.
Sorry.
Left. Anything else, I'll send you, Vince.
Okay, so
Mary,
Yes, Gary?
I have one thought. On the bold language,
Yes.
the last few words say currently reads on sea level rise in their deliberations and project planning. I was thinking as to whether or not we should try to put the word approvals in there as well, although it could be considered to be included in deliberations. But what we're really trying to say is that they need to take into consideration all of these things in the deliberations, approval, and project planning. Or the question is whether approval is a little stronger word, which means that they need to make sure before they approve something that they take the stuff into consideration. And I don't know if it fits comfortably to use approvals in addition to deliberations. resilience and project planning.
Comments? I don't really have enough knowledge of what we need to include to,
It's a little stronger
Yeah.
correction.
Do you want to say final
You're going to
projects?
approve.
In final projects, or you want to just, you basically want to say you want them, whatever is finally done, to be proper.
Maybe decisions instead of just approvals, because it's either approvals or
denials.
denial, yeah, so. Oh, yeah, so maybe to add to that language, to say decisions instead of purely approvals. Sorry, the feedback is really annoying.
It is. I think it's coming from the phone and from Mary's.
Oh, yeah.
You could say deliberations, decisions, and project planning.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, what was that word again?
Decisions.
Decisions.
I have another thing about the recommendation itself. I think I overall really like the language, but one thing I wanted to ask about of the group is that it specifically states sea level rise. It doesn't include storm surge or erosion specifically. So I don't know if we want to just be talking about sea level rise, or do we want to mention climate change impacts, or like to be more general, or do we want to be direct and spell out all the different things they should consider? Or are we just focusing on sea level rise for the purpose of this recommendation?
I thought we were just focusing on data. So with your recommendation, would there be, or change, would there be data associated with
There's
that?
erosion discussion in this document, so that's
Yeah.
why I mentioned it specifically. And there's storm surge. There's a section on storm surge, so that's the only reason I mentioned it, because then we add that to the data.
So just to clarify one thing really quickly, Fritz came up with the language for the recommendation, and I was just asked to put in supporting information. This is a committee recommendation. Whatever you guys want in here, or however you want it worded, just as long as it doesn't contradict too much with the source material, it's up to you guys.
I think it's great that it takes a really just purely like, here's the data, use it. We're not like making any bigger pictured recommendations right now, 'cause that's ahead of it.
And I would also ask another smaller question. Should there be, it's kind of in the first sentence as to some extent about how this is only a recommendation until the Coastal Resilience Plan comes online and starts to get used. Is there any other question about the timeline for this to be used in? Because this is only something to cover the next year and a half before the CRP starts to get used.
I think that in any case, whether it's a year, 6 months, whatever, I think that we shouldn't pick in the middle of what the predictions are. I think we should plan for the extreme, because we can always pull ourselves back. That just jumps out at me. I mean, none of the scientists in the world can say exactly what's going to happen, and things can just go awry quicker than can be studied and reported on. And here we are, a pile of sand at best 112 feet over sea level. I think we got to plan for the absolute worst instead of picking a middle number.
So you're talking about the intermediate, how you'd prefer to use the
Right.
extreme.
I just think that 4.66 is pretty conservative.
That's for 2080, and then there's another 2 lines. So just kind of a word to that. Whatever this committee decides, fine. I'm just a guy at a keyboard here, but just from my perspective, we've just had the risk assessment and strategies document, and in that it specifically says 4 to 6 feet, and that's kind of the most likely scenario.
Okay.
Well, I'm afraid I also agree with you, Peter, completely. I mean, every single projection I've read for the last decade has been an underestimate. And not a month goes by before you hear about what's happening in the Greenland sheet, the Antarctica sheet. And I think I would prefer to see the high, personally.
I would say that if we are going to recommend something that exceeds what was in the report we just received, then we need to reference some kind of reason for that. And that's where we might bring in Sarah's point about climate change effects more broadly than sea level rise.
Yeah, so that's one of the, I have a few things to talk about, but I think that to your point, Peter and Ian, I think that having it be the high makes sense to me to, if you're putting this out as a planning document or, to think of when planning. If we put the extreme, just the word extreme is, extreme. so just saying high would be better. But the question that's related that I had was then in the chart for the flood elevations on table 2, we don't then have a recommendation for those scenarios. And so, and there's a similar low, intermediate, high, and high. I know that's a different scale, but if we're going to be making one recommendation of a column, we should kind of do 2. And I think that the data that we can point to as reference would be the storm surge in addition to the sea level rise that's in the guidance document that we got.
So
were the 2 things.
Let me interject for a second. Our recommendation is only the line that's in bold. So we are providing this as supporting information. These are the data tables.
Right.
We're not saying to any department or board or commission that you must use the intermediate high. We're saying that you must use the most current data. And we are kind of leaving it up to them to decide which number is appropriate for a particular project. As I think Vince includes, did we put in, for the lifespan of the project as a consideration?
That was in an earlier form, I think.
Okay, we may have taken that out, then maybe we need to put that back.
But Madam Chair, I mean, the whole point of this is to prepare for what could be the worst case scenario. That's the way I look at this. I can't find the reference right now, but I think it was in October 2017 in Scientific American, which I'm happy to provide, on sea level rise on the northeast coast. It says right on the first page that this was 2 years ago, it used the figure 9 to 12 feet, which I guess is the extreme there. So I think it would be more helpful to the town to take in the worst case scenario, personally.
Mary?
Yes, Fritz?
When I started drafting this, I was thinking primarily in the context of, say, the planning board. And I think if we're going to come forth with a recommendation, it needs to be a recommendation that is not subjective. In other words, I don't think you're going to get this planning board to be making a subjective determination of what they should be taking into account in approving projects. It needs to be very objective data. So that, because what's going to happen is now you're going to go to every single board and commission is then going to be making a decision or not making a decision simply because it's subjective. And I think what we would hope to have is that the select board would be adopting our recommendation, and then that recommendation would be uniform with respect to every committee, board, or decision that's made. I just, to ask them to make a subjective determination, we're not in the business of being scientists, so somebody has to tell us, or the planning board, we have to have the data to say to a contractor, you must take this data into account in any plans that you bring before us. I guess that's my comment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Fritz. And I would say we do, within the text of the supporting information, say that the CRAC committee recommends the intermediate high. We do say that. So I think we do need to think about which scenario we are picking as the one that we are identifying, as you said, to give them the base information. And I think going with the high projection falls in line with what the Malone and McBroom article has given us, and we're providing the data from NOAA. So I don't think in any way that that's a bad thing for us to say that. The other slight point to that kind of gets back to what Vince was saying or asking as far as the timeline on it. And, we do say that it's pending the acceptance of the coastal resiliency plan. So I think perhaps then maybe even strengthening the language that what we're saying right now is use this document And I would even say past the acceptance of it, but maybe the implementation of the coastal resiliency plan, potentially just that idea that there is going to be more information coming out of that plan and more recommendations then that come forth, but this serves for the time being.
Quick
Matt?
comment, I sent a email out to a friend yesterday who has a friend who's redoing an old house in a storm path floodway, and I know they're doing a bunch of old beams are being replaced and everything else, and I just said, have they thought about being able to lift this thing at some future point? You know, they're gonna be rebuilding this house and spending, $1 million or something, and then having to like saw it and lift it. Why don't you plan it now? And I haven't heard back. But I think that's sort of the thinking that should be happening. And I don't know if they even, I think this person realizes they're in the, flood pathway, but I'm not sure. Maybe the engineers already figured out and said, yeah, we're gonna make it easy to lift. I have no idea. But I thought about it when I was walking by, and that's what you want people doing, at least now.
Well, and I think the power of making this recommendation is the town has had the storm surge pathways data for a long time. That's something we paid for and have, but it's not in common usage. So I think putting it out within this document, and I agree with Sarah, was stressing more than just sea level rise, but people outside of thinking about what sea level rise is and what level is coming, they're seeing the increased flooding anyway. So pushing that data in those maps is something people have to pay attention for, I think gives us another bump.
All right, so based on the comments, are we suggesting that the sentence in bold be changed to say, needs to be aware of and use the best and most current data on sea level rise, storm tide pathways, and erosion? Is that the feeling?
That's what I originally wrote in my own edits, but I would be interested to hear what you guys all think about having it say sea level rise and other impacts of climate change. Or I don't know, are we limiting ourselves by saying those three things, or is that what we really are recommending?
Can I make a comment briefly? So as it is currently worded, it only deals with sea level rise. Sea level rise is one of the things that is not in any way dealt with well by the town just yet, and that's the purpose of this committee. But what is relatively well dealt with is the flooding part of it. We do have FEMA standards and we have FEMA flood zones. So those are in place. As out of date and in need of updating as they are, they're still in place. So does flooding need to be brought into it in that case? That's for the committee to decide. Then to erosion, there will be more coming down the pipeline, as I've mentioned in the past, on erosion, probably in April, I'm thinking. It'll be another FEMA-style report, as I understand it, and then erosion will be covered in more detail. But what we are missing, and will continue to be missing, is the information on sea level rise. If you want to include more than that, that's up to the committee.
I worry about the erosion because I think we'd end up arguing about, how do you know it's going to erode, until we have that information. How will you know it's going to erode? How do you know?
So I'm kind of missing information on this as well. Yeah. It has to be said. But what I understand is this report that's on the way from FEMA next month will give predictive lines of with dates. But I'm not really sure. I have to say this is kind of speculative on my part just at the moment.
So we have the opportunity to issue a second recommendation if we need to. We might leave erosion until there's a new data set that we can respond to.
I would really feel strongly, though, about adding storm surge at least, because it does deal with water and it affects more than where the sea level rise.
I would agree with that as well.
Yeah. And you're saying storm surge after sea level rise, and you might also say related flooding. You just have to prepare people for, we know what storm surge is. I think the general public, I think flooding is easier for people to understand than storm surge. But if you put it all in there, stepping it down, sea level rise, storm surge, flooding.
How about, and the consequences of storm surge?
Again, the question is simply, are we including data with respect to all of those? The focus has got to be on data,
Well,
not,
we have,
We do have the table
We
that
have all the
combines
storm surge.
storm surge and sea level rise on the second page.
and that was the other thing was most of my other comments were about the storm surge section, because the storm surge section under additional resources only talks about Nantucket Harbor, but all the storm surge data that we have from Mark Borelli's work for the town is the whole island. And I think what the piece that I really want to make sure people are aware of is like the interior of the island that will flood with sea level rise and storm surge. So I think that's what I'm most concerned about is people like at the top of Mayacomet Pond or people that live in areas they don't think of Nantucket Harbor flooding them are going to be affected. So that's where I just wanted to make sure, or I could provide help with language or whatever, but just to make sure that it's more than just the harbor, it's all the interior areas as well. So I think that's why I think of adding storm surge, because we actually do have those data.
You can look at it on GIS. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, and the link is here. Like that's what I like the
Not
link.
fun like, watching what'll happen, but
Depends where you live if it's fun, Matt. I mean, the link is here, so obviously we're already pointing to it, just the language in it. I think we just want to make sure that it points out to those interior areas as well.
Yeah, again, this is only a base, but whatever language you guys want to edit or change, this one is completely up to the committee.
I just think you don't want the selectmen, because, well, Matt's here, but you don't want people to read it and go, oh, okay, and fix it in their minds, that that's what it is. And then say, all right, I'm not going to have to do all this. I just got to do this. I think you just got to prepare them with everything. So that when we come back with the plan and the recommendation becomes moot, they're already thinking that way. They're already thinking where we're going to be going with the plan.
okay. Just, again, from the point of view of the planning board, the planning board needs to have data that says then to an engineer, you're developing a residential development in this part of the island. You need to include this data in your report. That's what it's got to be. It can't be, we want you to take this into account and that into account, because the people sitting on that board, our board, will not understand any of that. So it has to be, this is the data, you engineer, you go use it and bring it back, and if it doesn't have that in the plan, then we won't approve it. That's the way it's got to be.
Yeah.
Plus, Fritz, you have one person on that board who isn't on our team, really.
What?
And,
But anyway.
Well, I think that's
what
not a
I'm saying is
discussion
That
for
could be
here.
on any,
Yeah.
that could be on any board, but
What
I
I'm
mean,
saying
yes,
is-
that's the political part of it.
I'm agreeing with you. The data is
Yeah.
very important to be able to point to.
Yeah.
And I think as we're going through this, what Fritz is saying, I'm really liking that we're giving the data and it's very specific. So, we have the section on sea level rise, we have a section on flooding, and I think we should decide if we are going to make a recommendation within those guidelines there, since we've done it with the sea level rise. And then I think that since we might do the erosion piece later, we take out that additional resources, take out the erosion, and instead move that storm surge up to the third thing that you need to consider. And provide those maps. And I don't know if we need to dig into that more to see if there's more data as far as a recommendation we want to make on storm surge levels and heights for what we're wanting them to plan for, or just broadly be aware of where you are within those storm tide pathways. So I think that would strengthen it if we're moving definitely towards this. Let's give them a direction and the data to back it up.
And I think if we're going to vote on what we're actually recommending, then I think that since we're pointing people to what the data are that we're using, like the NOAA 2017 SLR projections, then our table can be edited down to just have a shorter thing of what we recommend. Because I think if people look at this, and a lot of us have seen this before, so we're kind of used to kind of going, okay, the year and the different levels. But if we're not even recommending the VLM, which I'm assuming is like very low,
It's variable land movement. It's about
Oh.
it's about isostatic rebound after glaciers.
That was my
We'll
my
need
thing
to
was to
define that.
define. Yeah, if we're gonna keep it, we need to define it. But also, the low and the intermediate low, because the data are available for people to look at if they want to. But if we're making a recommendation, I think that our table has to be like, this is what we recommend. We can include if we're gonna, like, let's say we decide to recommend the high scenario, then we can still show the extreme so people are aware that if they want to overplan, that's awesome. But then,
I think
or
if we're-
totally tubular, as Mary would say. But then, sorry, but to make it exciting for the viewing audience. But the same thing with, I mean, I don't know if we're gonna make recommendations for flood elevation too, and then the storm surge data from the Center for Coastal Studies has, upwards of 13 feet. So we should probably, as to Fritz's point, pick a, if
a
not
range.
one, pick a range maybe to plan in.
I think if we do edit the table to only show one column, then we need to provide a link to the full table so that the public can get the source.
Data?
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah, we can nix
And
2010.
it's absolutely data-driven.
Well-
But, the thing is, all of these are data-driven. You can read models. Well, I haven't seen any data-driven
Ian, can you
model-
use the mic,
Sorry.
please?
I haven't seen, I was just agreeing with Fritz, and I think we're all on the same page about everything needing to be data-driven. But at this point, I don't think anybody really credits with a VLM low, interlow, or intermediate as being realistic. Intermediate, possibly, but I think from what I've read, from the int high to the high, seems to be where we're going to end up if we're lucky. So, I mean, there are dozens and dozens of studies out there, so it's a question of where you throw your dart, in a sense.
Okay, so do we have to vote on anything?
No,
what are
we're just
how are we
editing a
moving forward?
document.
Okay.
So-
But I would like us to keep the entire table in there. Clearly, I think we're all agreed, right?
I think it confuses the point to keep the whole table in there, because we point to where the data are available. But I mean, my opinion would be to edit it down to include only years 2020 to 2100, and then to only include, if we are going to recommend high, then just include the high and the extreme. But
So if you edit out the first two rows for 2000 and 2010, then would you have to adjust to remove, for instance, in the intermediate high column, the 0.79 to date, and use 2020 as a base year?
Well,
oh, that's a good point. I see what you're saying.
well, what you'd lose is your base year. You'd have no 0 years.
Yeah.
So
So, Sarah, I guess the reason why I feel that it might be prudent to keep the entire table in there would be that so that no one going forward could say that we've skewed the data in any way. So we've made our own collective choice of what we think is the most probable based on what we've read and know, but here is the range of projections. So
I can see that, as long as we're really clear with what our recommendation is, because I appreciate Fritz's point of giving a more clear set of guidelines, because we should also, and then instead of highlighting the whole entire column, to highlight the year that we hope to plan for as well. So
Well,
whether
that
we're
goes back to the point about each project has a different lifespan, so you wouldn't design something that's going to last for 10 years for a 100-year
right.
event. So I think we do need to keep the progression through the future. But we might need to go back and add something about the lifespan of the project to interpret the data, based on the lifespan of the project. So the other general feeling that I'm hearing is that it isn't the one sentence that's the recommendation, it's really the entire document becomes more a whole and less of the supporting role for some of that information.
Does everyone agree with that?
Agree with what?
The highlighted line here, just
Yeah,
added based on what Mary was saying. Please interpret these data based on the lifespan of the project.
I don't know if the word interpret is really the word we want, but please choose the appropriate,
Please plan.
plan for the lifespan of the project.
Plan?
Yeah.
Please plan based on these data.
Let's try,
Please plan.
I'll say please.
The lifespan of this project based on this data.
or please incorporate the data based on the lifespan of the project.
I don't think we need to say please.
I agree.
Sorry.
Hope your children aren't watching.
Please plan the lifespan of the project. 420. Do you want to put a time frame in there? No. Based on these data.
Would it be these data sets?
Data is already a plural word.
Yeah.
Okay.
Datum is singular.
I don't think that's quite getting at to the point, but it's kind of hard to wordsmith in a group on a screen. But I think the how to say it is to pick the year projection that fits the expected lifespan of the proposed project, right?
You could say projects should use the data for the, I don't know.
Appropriate for the lifespan.
Yeah, appropriate for their lifespan,
of the
yes.
project.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jen had something there.
I think Fritz and Mary kind of got it.
No, appropriate for the lifespan.
I couldn't say it again if I had
Please
to.
use the data appropriate for the lifespan of the project,
There we go. So please use the data appropriate for the lifespan of the project.
or use.
Yeah,
Use the data.
yeah.
We're so polite.
Yeah, please use the mic, but use the data,
Use it.
yeah.
Don't please, use it.
Use the date.
So my question is, wait, if it's a housing project, what's the lifespan of the project? 2100?
No, the occupants have a different answer to the contractor.
Yeah. Well, there are houses on Main Street that have been there for more than 100 years, right? So,
Well, I would hope that people are designing the house to be physically, structurally whole for at least 100 years, yes. Although in the 70s, that wasn't the case.
I say nothing.
Okay, use the data based on the lifespan of the project. Everyone happy?
appropriate. Didn't we say appropriate? Yeah.
Use the
Use the data appropriate for the lifespan of the project.
Appropriate for
sorry.
instead of based on, appropriate for.
Appropriate.
Thank you.
Appropriate for. Yeah.
Ugh.
It's no fun to edit when everyone's watching.
I'm not worried. I know I'm not good at spelling.
Yeah.
And these would become the,
And did we actually change the text of the bolded recommendation? Did we?
I just highlighted a yellow because I wasn't sure there was consensus yet. And if you wanted the word flood as well.
I would personally like to take out the consequences of, because I think we just say storm surge, but.
well, there's tidal flooding unrelated to storms.
I think as we've been saying, we'd be very specific to what we're directing people to. And if there are 3 sections to our data, there's sea level rise data, there's flooding data, and there's storm surge data, then I think those are the three words that we put in the recommendation.
Sea level rise, storm surge, sea level rise, flooding, and storm surge. Okay.
Yeah, I like that.
That's a good reference.
All right, other comments, or are we going to leave this with Vince to send back out in a revised fashion?
Yeah, Vince, do you need more, or do we need to all agree on our actual recommendations for scenarios?
No, this is a committee recommendation. Anything you want or in this document or that you think is missing, please send it along. And then once everyone votes, all you need is a majority vote. You don't need, it'd be nice to have a unanimous answer.
I guess I mean from right now, do you need anything more from us to edit?
Or is the direction clear?
Is it, yeah?
Yeah, so the committee seems pretty happy. I'm just, the recommendation seems pretty okay. Take out the VLM data, and then take out the erosion stuff. Am I missing anything?
Yes, go back to where it says 4 to 6 feet. You know, the fact
Ian, you want
is-
to use the mic?
So the inter-high, keep on, can you scroll down to show the inter-high to 2,100?
Yep.
Well, I would prefer the high, which is,
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, so that would alter the 4 to 6 feet to
Well,
7 to 9.
This is a reference that came straight from the Coastal Resilience Plan. Coastal Resilience Risk Assessment and Strategies. That is a direct copy and paste.
So again, to Vince's point, as a committee, we can decide that we want to use something different, but he's explaining where that selection came from.
All right, I would just say that the CRAC recommends following the high NOAA projection,
Right.
you know, of 7 to 9 feet.
I hate to that's just a committee recommendation, and then that ends up being based on what then?
Right on
NOAA
the,
data.
on the
I mean-
data sets, which I still feel that you should write data sets, and I'm well aware that datum is the singular since I took 6 years of Latin, God help me. But anyway, back to the matter at hand.
So you would just remove the first sentence that says?
No, I think that's fine. No, I think this,
Okay.
that's up to you.
Okay. Sorry, it's up to this committee, not me.
We're talking, Mary.
Vince, can you get a little closer to the mic? I'm having trouble hearing you.
I just think we want to make clear that we would like to have the focus on the high set.
So there's this sentence here where I went with the upper end of the 4 to 6 feet and went with 6 feet as the closest being the intermediate high. If you want to change that sentence,
Well, that's what I suggested. The CRAC recommends following the high NOAA projection, comma, 7.74 to 9.25 feet to accommodate moderate storm surge,
It isn't
et cetera.
7.74 to 9.25. Those are both projections for different years.
That's, well, all right. But he says 4 to 6 feet.
Right, that's coming from a different source, that
Yeah,
4 to
okay.
6 feet, yeah.
Whatever you prefer, Mary. But I mean, I just,
Yeah, I would just say use the high projections because the time frame is
Yeah.
involved in interpreting the NOAA data, where the previous sentence was not multiple timeframes.
okay.
so the CRAC recommends following the high NOAA projection, comma, 9.25 feet at the year 2100.
Well, no, I wouldn't add anything with the comma. I would just say follow the high because at 2020, at 2030, at 2040, yeah.
Yeah, I think that first sentence of that paragraph, I know where it came from because we've already read that document, but I feel like it's a little misleading because it's not, it doesn't say that that's what scenario that they chose to look at for that in that sentence. So it makes it sound like we're going against the Malone and McBroom report, but we're just picking a different scenario, a higher scenario to plan for, where they only chose to use
So can I just make a little suggestion?
Yeah.
Personally, from my point of view, I think high is just a bit too much, but that's just me. The committee has to decide. But one way around it might be to say to have increased redundancy, give a justification, give a logic for why.
Okay, I think we did already. I think we all agreed with high, or most of us. I haven't heard anybody say no about planning for the high. And then we also said, because to date, most of the projections that have, every year as we've come along, the projections have been low. And so we can we can provide data. We can provide citations if that helps.
Happy to provide citations if that helps.
So
I don't know whether we need to include that in this report. Certainly to the extent the select board would say, why are you choosing this? We can make that statement.
I agree, but I think just Vince seems that we need to back ourselves up.
I think it's to persuade Vince rather than persuade anybody on the committee.
Well, okay, let's change gear then. Matt, how do you see how the select board reacting to this?
Well, they're going to ask questions, and I'm probably not going to be able to answer them because I have questions.
Okay.
They're going to ask.
So here's
the question. So where were we from 2000 to 2010?
I was looking at this data just the other day, and if you look at the data from 1965 when the tide meter was put in, right up to 2019, we have all that data,
right.
And I've been picking through it, and it's about 1.4 inches per decade. That's about 1.1 of a foot.
Well, that's an average. It's higher and lower on any given.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's an average.
So the question is...
But there's another point to that.
Right.
Predictive data like this has no relationship as such it's only based on historic data and other variables such as carbon emissions. That's what this is really based on. We can't use the historic data alone without understanding.
No, I understand that, but so if someone said, how much did we rise from 2000 to 2010? What's the answer?
About 1.4 inches, but
Okay,
that's not a valid enough answer.
That's good. So we're looking here and saying intermediate high is 36, 0.43?
Yeah, but 0.3 of a foot. So that's a bit more than, that's actually about double, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's what I'm asking, yeah.
Yeah.
And
But
so then from 2000 to, because people are going to look at those first two projections as their baseline, I would say. And what have we done from 10 till now?
So I tried this, and I've been working on a document to try and support this, and it's unsupportable. It's not something that works out. I get it because I tried it.
Right. So it's only supportable if you add in carbon emissions and the other things that are happening,
Correct.
which I agree with you, Ian. But I'm saying, I'm just sort of understanding Vince's hesitancy, because then you end up having to make the argument.
Well, to borrow a financial phrase, past performance does not guarantee future results. The conditions in the future will be different. And the reason this is such a big deal is because we expect this to accelerate.
Oh, completely. I get it.
But this isn't the time to be conservative in our recommendations. I think we're just asking people to plan and think about it. Obviously, this doesn't hold weight right now, and it's a recommendation. So I think this is where we be not extreme, but we say, here, plan for this, because this is not, to me, this is not where we are conservative and say, okay, do the least amount of that you want to do.
I'm going to put another perspective on that. From a scientific standpoint, it's easy to say, use the greatest possible scenario, but the select board are not scientists. They're not providing a scientific recommendation. There has to be a balance, not only between the cost of things and the things that you recommend, but also between the various alternatives. Retreat is an alternative. Adaptation is an alternative. And when you say you must plan for the extreme event, what you're saying is you don't have any alternatives. And that's not the case.
Retreating is part of planning, though. That's a potential to plan for. I think we have a responsibility, honestly, if we say, only plan for 4 feet, and we know that the best data actually say something higher, then people can, then it's like, well, we're not doing our justice to the community by saying only plan for 4 feet, even though we know the actual projections right now say 6. I just feel like in a recommendation,
But
we
what
have
are we asking?
data.
What are we asking the boards and the departments to decide? Are we telling them that they must create infrastructure that will withstand 10 feet of sea
That's
level
not what
rise?
this says. This says to consider the data when you're making plans, when you're deliberating, and what else did we say? Sorry.
So I've highlighted up there. So this is only for town departments, boards, commissions and committees, and any service providers, contractors, etc. So this isn't for the general public as such. This is only an interim for the town and its committees.
So where the town is spending money, essentially.
And we are giving this data for planning purposes. The boards can then make that decision that, okay, if we plan for X, it's going to cost this amount. We can't do that. So we're going to acknowledge that we're planning in this way, realizing that there might be some impacts associated with it. So we're giving the data. We're not telling them to be scientists. We're not telling them to use this and figure out the best scientific way to use it. It's here's the data that scientists have already put together for us and given us the reasons for what this looks like. Use it in your planning. And as a advisory board, we have the potential to gather all that data and decide what are we going to make the best recommendation on.
So Fritz, does that, do you see that as workable within what your concern was for the planning board being able to make a decision or being able to provide instruction?
I guess all I'm trying to say is I don't want to I don't think the planning board should be in a position of having to interpret what this means. In other words, it's simply saying to the engineers, if you're designing a project that is going to be coming before us for our approval, that project must include this data, not different sets of data, and we'll tell you which one we want you to use, because the board will never make that.
Yeah, and when you, to take your comment to the extreme, Jen, and I'm not trying to pick on you, but when you say that, okay, here's the data and you have to plan for it, but you can plan to not react to the most extreme data, then somebody can say, well, yeah, I looked at the data and I planned that the community will be wiped out by a flood in 2775, and that's my plan. And you're not giving the board any direction on what to do about that.
No, this document is not intended to give them direction on what to do about anything. This document is intended to give the boards the data that we have right now that we don't believe is necessarily being discussed in all of these deliberations. So we give them this data, they make their decisions based on this data. We can't necessarily say you can't make that decision or this decision because we don't have a coastal resiliency plan yet. We don't have direction for all these things, but we can give them the data so it is being discussed and how these projects are being looked at.
So just hearing my left ear and my right ear, those two statements sound like they're completely in opposition. We're giving
Not
you
at
data. Well, I'm confused.
Okay, so this is how I'm hearing it. I'm going to use a planning board as an example because of Fritz's representation. So if we say we're going to, the CRAC committee recommends using the high scenario, and if your project is to 2100, you're going to use the 9.25 feet. So if you're planning a project, and so that's like a clear directive. So if you're planning a project anywhere in an area that will be inundated by sea level rise, then you would plan for 9 foot of sea level rise. I'm not an engineer, so I don't know, so the engineer would be the one to take that information and make the plan, I don't know, whatever, bury something, seal something, or raise it up, or whatever the project is, but they're thinking about that. And that's one thing when I got this document yesterday, I really liked about it is it uses the data we have now, and it's just giving, here's the information, here's all the data we agree on. I mean, it's NOAA data, it is the best, it's what everybody uses. And then the storm surge data that we already have, that the town already paid for, it's just putting it in a very simple place to say, use this when you're planning. It's not saying how to do something because we're not part of all these other committees. It's just here's the data, use it. And I think, like the HGC, use here's the data, use it to the, and we point to where the maps are available, because like you were saying, we've had this data available on the town GIS for some time, and a lot of people don't know it or access it regularly. So just knowing that it's there. And I don't think it's in opposition to what Fritz is saying at all. I think that's just providing the information. I think some more of the details will come out with the plan, is what my assumption is, in the exact recommendations for different parts of the community. But this is like, here's the information we have right now for the island, and this is what we recommend. That's kind of our job as this committee, is to recommend to the town,
That,
Okay, so perhaps I got misled. You were saying that too much data, Fritz, is the problem, not that we're just giving data?
too much data.
Well, too many options. So,
No, I don't, no, if we're saying high, I don't
Okay.
think that's too many options. Yes, the question then is, what's the lifespan of the project? That's something that a board can more easily interpret. What's the lifespan of a housing project? Or what's the lifespan of a public building that's going to be built someplace? That's easier to interpret, or at least understand. Let me just give you two examples in terms that come up to mind. I think when Rob McNeil was talking to us at one point, he made a reference to, we said, what can we do? One of the questions, and I don't remember whether it was his presentation here or before the planning board or something, but one of the questions was, well, what can we do? And he said, we're using old data for sea lice purposes in designing wastewater systems. We should be using more modern, up-to-date data. And to me, that's what this should be. Same thing, if you're going to the HDC and you're getting an approval for the siting of a project, or the Concom, and you have a rule that all the mechanical equipment in the building must be 2 feet above sea level. I mean, I don't know what it is, I'm just saying that. That's a standard that has to be met. Then what we're saying is, okay, based upon the projected life of that project, that house, whatever, you go and it's going to be 7 feet or it's going to be 9 feet. That may be very different from what it is today. That's what I'm talking about. That's how you apply it.
okay, so.
I'm not telling an engineer how you engineer a building to take that into account. That's not what we are. Engineers do that. It's simply the question, the board can simply say to the engineer or the architect, how have you taken this data into account in designing this project? And we
Okay,
listen
Peter?
to them, and we either believe it or don't believe it.
I think it's my mic. Going off of what Fritz said and what Sarah said, and I agree with all of it, then back up at the recommendation, you need to have something that says, and I don't know how you're going to say it, but basically, the select board needs to be aware that this data is going to change. It's going to go up. They need to be thinking that. It's so important that whoever looks at the charts don't fixate on a number and going, I'm set. I don't got to worry, thinking that this is the law or whatever. It isn't, and we're going to come up with a plan that's going to the best of our abilities and Vince's abilities and the consultant's abilities, is going to say, this is what we think should happen now or in the future based on the data that we have. But somewhere it needs to say the data is going to change. Most likely the predictions are going to go up. You need to put that in people's heads. Otherwise, they're going to fixate on the numbers and go, "Oh, cool, that's or whatever," or "Oh, that sucks." Or
Well, in the long run, we're all dead. So I just keeping in mind that this is a recommendation for the moment. It does say use current data. So when there's newer data, that newer data should be incorporated, and all of these things are supposed to get revisited at least every 5 years to be updated. I don't think we need to anticipate all of the future changes to all of the projected changes. That's a bit too much to ask in this context.
I'm not saying that we're going to anticipate and say that this number is going to jump to this. It's just more general than that. I think you just need to remind people that it is going to change. I think it's really important that you put that in people's heads, because the select board is a way busier board than we are. They have many, 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 many things going on, a lot more than we do. It needs to be abundantly clear, that's all.
So I got the wrong month when I quoted the Scientific American article. It's August 2018. It's called the title is Surrendering to Rising Seas. And in the bullet points, I'll read them all. There are 3 of them. As sea levels rise, some coastal communities are confronting a future of both chronic and extreme flooding. Retreat, permanently moving people and property away from the water, is radical, but in some places it is inevitable. Second bullet point, even well-managed retreat is messy and painful. It has rarely been tried at all. One New Jersey town is experimenting with moving a cluster of people out of harm's way and turning to the newly opened land into a flood buffer to protect the rest of the community. Third bullet point, planning for how and when communities will need to retreat involves many variables. New Jersey could see up to 12 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Social, political, and economic factors add to the complexity. So I'll send the link to Vince and ask him to send it to you. Would you want that?
Well, certainly, but
I understand.
I'm not sure how you're trying to apply it to our discussion right now.
The 12 feet,
Well, 12 feet for New Jersey might happen is not something that we can throw out NOAA's predictions for our local area. I mean, I'm having difficulty with that.
Well, I quoted that article and I got the wrong month, and the height was even more extreme than I thought. So that's the reason why I've actually read it out. Yeah. And New Jersey isn't that very far from Massachusetts. And it's further reason why I think we should be going with the high projection at the minimum.
Gary, I want to make sure you have a chance to jump in if you have any comments.
No, I'm listening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, can I just make a little...
Yeah.
So Ian made a point about how New Jersey is quite close. However, various spots throughout the East Coast are going to be impacted very, very differently. I was just looking at information like this yesterday, and I even sent a link on this to Mary yesterday. What I'll do is I'll send that link out to the whole committee as well. It's NOAA data again. So we can't exactly rely on the bathtub model, as it gets called. We're not equal, or will have equal effects as New Jersey. In fact, we don't even have equal effects to other parts of New England. Boston is going to be lower sea level rise than us. We already know this. So what I'll do is I'll just send the information out. You can just have a look at it and you can see how New Jersey is adversely affected more than we are, which is a fair point. It is, but we're not New Jersey.
I already know that, Vince. I don't know why we're butting heads all the time.
We're not.
And you're not the only person who's read about this issue. I'm sort of, you know what? I'm getting irritated. Excuse me. Perhaps I should leave and come back next time. It's just...
You're welcome to stay, Ian.
Well, I'll bring this back sort of to a little bit to real life. We're dealing tonight, the select board is approving the contract for the Harbor Masters building, and the elevations and things I think are okay. I don't know, but they've got, I sent it to Vince. I don't know if he's got it. It's page 43 of our packet tonight, and we don't have it on the screen. That's fine. But, and this is the part where, the select board, our eyes glaze over. How do we know? We've got this thing in front of us and we're worried about this. And, elevation 6'7", elevation top of finished first floor, 9 feet 7 inches. Elevation, base flood elevation is 11 feet. And the elevation top of protection wall is 13 feet. So those are sort of, potential reflective wave, 14.7. So the engineers, I'm just using this as an example because we're saying, when does this happen? Here's some data, and the engineers have, taken into account. And the question I can't answer just looking at it is, did they take into account what we're talking about for a 50-year building or not? I don't know.
No, but as a review committee or whoever's reviewing those kinds of engineering, you could ask what scenario they based those elevations and numbers on. So like giving what we're talking about right now, the information gives the board the power to be able to say, okay, we know we need to ask where you got that data from and that there are different scenarios and projections. And so hopefully that at least gives a little more basis.
I think the reason we have the plans with us is because last time it came up, I asked and said, is this what data is this based on? Oh, we took it into account. Well, is it X feet over? No, it can't because the ramp will be too long. So I think what they're showing me is that, yeah, we're taking it into account as much as possible for this building, so anyway, and I don't have the answer. I'm just saying it's the reality of it when you're in the trenches sort of looking at these things like I am as a select board member and like Fritz is at the planning level, is it's fairly difficult to monitor and to monitor these and argue with engineers who have been paid and have been directed various ways on these projects. It's hard. Anyway.
I appreciate that example.
Yeah.
It's great that you can ask a question and they have to respond to it. That means we are miles ahead of where we used to be a year or 2 or 3 ago when the questions weren't even asked.
Thank you, Gary. Good point.
There's a glass more than half full. Thank you.
Sarah, you were going to add something?
Yeah, I was just saying I appreciate that example because it helps put into context what we were just talking about. And I think that really puts into a concrete example of what we were saying about, having the recommendation. And then when there's something like the lifespan of the building is 50 years and the ramp, there's some limitations with that, then they're going to use like a little bit of a less of the projection or whatever, then the board can decide whether or not that's an acceptable compromise. And in some cases it might be. And that's just up to the decision of the board. But then they have this information to be able to ask the question. So I think that, the sooner we can get this out, the better, because I think it really, will help. And I don't know, obviously we have representation right now from certain boards, but I don't know if there needs to be an educational aspect if this trickles down beyond the select board to the other boards and committees, but
all right,
that's
so
another thought.
In the interest of our agenda, is there anybody who has something new they want to add? Vince can do another draft. We can bring it back.
Just before we go, Fritz passed me an idea for this last sentence. I just want to get input before we wrap it up. He said the previous sentence was what was getting to what Pete was saying, but the new sentence is, however, these data are periodically updated. Does that work with the committee?
I think that's a good point to add, just to call out the fact that the data change. Yeah.
Pete, does that work for your purposes? Yeah. Good.
Okay. I want to pause just for a moment. Are there members of the public who have a comment on our discussion about a recommendation to the select board? No. Okay. We will move on to the discussion of any town meeting articles that committee members feel may have a coastal resilience component. And I see we do have one proponent of an article that probably is one we want to talk about, but we can start there if anybody wants to, or we can start somewhere else. Happy to take suggestions. All right, Rick, did you have anything that you wanted to say to us about your article in particular? And Rick, would you remind me what number article yours is?
74.
Somehow 86 comes in my mind.
Rick,
that's not a lucky number.
No, Rick, you're number 61.
61, thank you. I got me. No, I just would like to...
Is that mic on?
Are you all set there?
Yeah.
I'm not sure your mic is on. That was the only thing.
Oh, okay, sorry. Is it on?
Yeah, that's on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. It's like I'm in love with it, boy.
Oh,
There we
that's
go.
great, yeah.
Just to remind us all that the planning board made a negative recommendation. I don't know what the finance committee's recommendation is yet. At least it's not in the package submitted to the board, the select board, earlier this week. Last time they disagreed with the planning board and recommended the article. I have suggested to the planning board a couple of possible amendments which didn't strike any interest at all. One was changing the 300 feet to 100 feet. You know, if you're concerned about too many inland parcels, get started with a measurement that doesn't impact as many. I also suggested changing the coverage to be only applied to new dwelling units. Neither one seemed to be of any interest, and the planning board, I think, is trying to say, not our territory. I interpret that, quite frankly, as they're saying, gee, maybe we have other interests we're paying attention to, rather than the interest of the citizens who we're trying to protect in this article from liability and claims. And often those come in a very subtle way. The claims and threats are not open. They're very subtle. I can share that from my experience on the
Well, I'd like to
Board
stay
of
with the
Selectmen.
substance of the article, please, Rick.
You know, the substance of the article talks about asking people who are building near erosion-prone areas to provide a liability waiver to the town. And to me, that's in the citizens' interest to protect them from financial harm. And I think those who don't appreciate the article have to consider the flip side, because I think it puts them in the position of, in effect, saying, we like the status quo. And this is sort of a moral suasion, a kind of a warning to people that they acknowledge they're developing in an area of risk. And I think when you don't do that, you're kind of saying, don't worry about it. The town's not interested in making sure you know there's risk. So it's sort of the flip side of the article. I've had a number of people come up to me and hope that town meeting discusses the article because they support the concept of the article. I think it makes sense, and we'll see what happens with electronic voting, whether there's a support at this time or not. So those are my comments for you.
Thank you, Rick. Any comments on Rick's article from members of the committee? Or questions for Rick?
I support it in concept. I'm not sure it goes far enough because I don't think it, it's not taking in storm pathways and other problems that we're going to see. And I've talked to Rick about that. So I'm not, maybe it should be worded differently. I think I'm glad it's coming to town meeting. It's if only just for educational. And I think if someone will call it, we will talk about it. I'm almost certain of that. And there are and what happens, at least from my perspective, what happens is there's things that the state law hasn't caught up with the modern reality. The town is responsible for roads. We had it issue at Sheep Pond. We're having it again. We've got the stuff going on at Baxter, and the liability would release the town from having to do a lot of takings and build a road, or and build a road to somewhere that why would we even build it there to begin with? I question whether we want to really be bringing sewer out to Nantucket, even though water quality is important. But I worry that if we bring sewer out, we're just doubling down. We're going to build more and bigger houses out there, and then people are going to want more, more services and more protection and take care of our roads. So I think that as a community, it's a important thing to be thinking about. If there are areas that should be favoring retreat over the middle to long term, then we should be careful about investing millions and millions of dollars into those areas to begin with. So I think Rick's article is sort of a step to us thinking about that. I don't think there's a lot of people really thinking this way yet, and so, I'm glad that we're going to have a discussion about it.
Okay, Vince, did you have something?
Yeah, just catch up on one or two things that. Yep.
Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
From Rick's article is whether it will change people's behavior. That would be good, because if it probably shouldn't be built and people want to build it anyway, then at least the town wouldn't be responsible. So that's a good result. But the best result would be that people wouldn't build in places where they shouldn't be building anyway. We can't go that far, and I assume that the planning board or any of the other boards that have to give approval might not be able to, on their own, say to the applicant, you want to get approval for this project, we'll give you the approval, but only if you sign a waiver. I'm not sure that without Rick's amendment, the planning board, others would be able to do that.
Thank you, Gary. Vince, yeah.
Okay, so Matt briefly referenced the state law on this. It's MGL Chapter 258, and that already absolves the town from liability of somebody building on their property and then losing the property to erosion. I don't know, maybe Rick could advise correctly, if this article deals with roads and other infrastructure, as Matt was talking about, because if it did, then it would actually be of use.
Yeah.
Rick?
In 2015, I think it was, that the town manager in one of her iterations discussing this article at that time indicated that because there were state existing laws concerning roads, that the waiver does not cover those right now. I think Matt's pointed out that the issue with roads is really pertinent here to our community, because there are interesting cases around the country. Most of the one that's well known is in Florida. I think it's St. Johns County. And the county in that case was held liable for continuing to maintain a road that's right on the beach in order to protect houses away from the beach. And the court implied the liability is infinite. You've got to keep repairing that road forever, which is just, I think, an absurd solution. And our state has to learn how to deal with that. And it's happening not just here. The town of Falmouth has roads all along the coastline. Others do as well, and they're all going to have to make decisions about that. This is a little bit different, however, because it talks about people building on their own property. It's not dealing with the public roadways in some of these other situations. I don't know if that answers your question. The other one, were you referring to the town council's opinion about municipal liability when you mentioned that section, Vince? I wasn't sure what the section referred to.
I was just talking about Chapter 258.
Well, help me what 258 is. Maybe everybody else here knows,
yeah.
But I don't.
So it's MGL Chapter 258, otherwise known as the Torts Claim Act, and it absolves.
Yeah, I think it goes up to $100,000. And to me, this is as much a kind of a moral suasion issue as it is a money issue. I think if you just note occasionally in the press, you'll find someone suing a town for amounts well in excess of the tort claim limit. And there may be other situations where you can get around that if there's negligence or other issues. I'm not the expert in that one. So, but I don't think that section of mass law negates the intent of this article.
Thank you, Rick. Okay, are there members of the public who have other articles that they came to discuss with the committee? No, okay. Other members of the committee who have articles that they wanted to bring up for discussion? No. Vince had done a quick run-through of articles that he felt might be relevant. Vince, do you want to scroll through that list, and we'll see if anybody has any questions?
Sure. Sorry, there's going to be a lot of scrolling in this, but I'm just going to get to the ones that I'd noted. Article 14 first. This is about the kind of emergency program that's going on at Children's Beach at the moment. I don't know if the committee wanted to weigh in on this one. No, I'll keep going.
I think we support it.
Yeah,
So,
I think
so the question is,
Wait. Can you go back, please?
Sorry.
this is that pump that's
Yeah.
it's down there now.
I'm just double checking. Yeah, that it's improvement.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the question is, is the committee wanting recommendations from the committee included, or what's the?
This was solely to provide a forum for discussion at this point, but if the committee felt strongly about anything, then we could offer a recommendation to the select board.
Is that, so we're not referring to a temporary pump that's makes such a racket there? So we're not going to add silence to?
So my understanding is that one of the purposes of this is that they'll end up with kind of like a building around it to reduce the noise in.
Right. I'm sure the neighbors will be very happy with that.
I will too when I go to monitor it.
And one thing to keep in mind is this is simply an appropriation article. It's not about specs for this. It's just, are we going to spend money on it?
Okay. 18. This is a waterways improvement. This is only somewhat tentatively linked to coastal resilience because there's issues about dredging are mentioned in it, and breakwaters, piers, wharfs, that kind of stuff. But again, this is just to make sure that we have funding to deal with some of these Chapter 91 issues, but if the committee wants to weigh in.
No? Okay. Next one.
Okay. Sorry, but Article 29.
Can you say that a little louder, Ben?
Article 29. This is about Harbour Place, which has come up here in the past.
And that's basically an appropriation of $150,000 to have the ability to do some of the study that we need to do down there, so.
But at least for me, this is one of the locations that really prompted me to get involved and interested in making sure that coastal resilience was considered.
I mean, with some of these, with the appropriations things, and I appreciate doing this because I think it's important for us to review the articles. I don't see us necessarily making recommendations this year, but in future years, this committee might be called to do that. But like for this one, I wouldn't have comments on it, but it highlights it as the fact that a consultant will be hired so we can begin to pay attention to that project.
Great.
Right. And the things that were being talked about are, sort of what's the proper sewer pipes down there, the issues like that, roads and sewer pipes and storm drains and someone to look at all that and make recommendations before it's built and we realize we should have looked at it. Yeah.
Yep. All okay? I'll move on. Next one, Gary, is Article 36. So this is something about a legal opinion on beach access. This is so the town can fund a study to see about beach access in terms of the colonial ordinance and in relation to Chapter 91 as well, as I understand. I can only imagine this is kind of close to Matt's heart.
Can you nod on the mic?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's going to. I think the recommendation from a couple of people is it's not necessary. I'm not sure. But I will see at town meeting. It's I've talked about it here a bunch of times. I think that we have more rights than we know we have, and I think they've slowly eroded. A slight detour, but what happens over time, and we're seeing this right now with the HDC, and this is just a good object lesson. The sign committee asked for a recommendation on sort of signs and windows, because over time they've been worn down by the vested interest or their lawyers. Eventually they forget that they have complete control of that. So we had to get another town council recommendation so that they know yeah, we can actually enforce this. And the HDC, it's happening also with demolitions. Over time, the HDC board, they have so much work, they see so many applications, they forget they have the ability to prohibit completely a demolition. And so, but they've forgotten that over time because people are in front of them all the time, pushing for various things. And then eventually the board kind of, so I think I think those are recent examples, in my lifetime. This is an example that's been going on for 100 years, where I think it slowly has eroded. So anyway.
I'm kind of with you on this one, Matt. I'd actually kind of like to see this one go ahead for legal clarity, but it is what it is. Anyone else? Okay, 38 next, Article 38. This is only kind of tenuously linked again, but this is about the re-establishment of the Parks and Rec Department. They have some responsibility over some things at beaches, say at Jetty's Beach where the children's playground area is. So I just thought I'd include it just for wholeness, even though it's only tenuously linked.
Well, I think that it brings up a point, because as I'm thumbing through the book trying to keep up, I'm passing over things like the appropriations that are made by the community preservation. And some of those are for playing fields and so on. And some of those might be things that wouldn't necessarily get a review for coastal resilience, but perhaps they should. So as Jen was saying, I like doing this exercise just so we start thinking about some of these things.
Okay. So the next one that I had was Article 61, which we just covered, so the coastal resilience liability waiver. And then the last one I had was Article 74. And this is probably not very well related either. And I think this one also had somewhat of a negative review from Town Council. So this one was about fencing down to and within tide lines. I've already spoken with the sponsoring agents on this one, Bruce and the Coastal Conservancy, and we've looked at amendments and such. But there was potential conflict with beach fencing for birds, but also just to bring this to coastal resilience. This would also potentially limit some works that might potentially happen within tide lines, which is kind of why I'm bringing it up here.
Comments?
And remind me, what has town council said about this again?
I think I read negative review.
Right.
Rick, did you have a question on this? Yeah.
Well, just in terms of town council, I participated in meetings with town council on this article. He never had a problem with the language of the article. He was helpful in thinking through amendments that might be made to address some of the issues Vince just raised. So I wouldn't go so far as to say town council had a problem with the article, just to be clear. Okay.
And also remind everybody that there are now videos. I don't know if any of these particular articles have they've done a video interview with the proponents. I haven't looked at them yet, but that's another potential resource.
Which one? I'm looking. I don't think I have it here. I've got some of his recommendations. I don't have this one.
Okay, they're the ones that I had. If there's anything else that anyone feels I missed, happy to go and scroll to that.
Yeah.
So please don't go online and watch those videos, because I made 3 of them and all I do is mumble and stutter.
We're used to that now.
We won't judge you.
That won't bother us.
Again, thank you for doing this. I do think it might be useful perhaps to keep the list of the ones that we referred to and then bring it back post-town meeting as far as the outcome and see if there was a way that we want to look at it going forward, or just thinking in the future if there were stuff we wanted to respond to, what that would look like.
The one about the fences is an interesting issue, because what happened last summer was the police didn't just go down to the high tide line and stop and allow people to still pass and repass for fishing and fouling if you're following the strict state rules. They went right into the water. And so that's something that had, in my lifetime has been a complete no-no. It's when people did it, they would come out, the DPW would rip it out, the fire department would rip it out. I remember Bruce Watts put the signs all around the island, and anyone, sort of A, for safety, but B, to assert those as public rights or public ways. And, it just was something that never was allowed. Scott White, and I don't blame Scott for this, because he had an issue with dogs, unleashed dogs going on his property that was not addressed. He has been complaining about it for a number of years. Nobody was really taking was helping him with it. And so finally, the only solution he had was the police, who said, well, okay. And they went out to stake it into the water and don't let anyone pass. So that was how that happened. Not having a beach advisory committee, I think, was a very big negative, because it led to, people just not paying attention to it. But I think as the island gets busier, and as it has gotten busier, and as the conservation and the land bank have opened up more parking areas and walking areas, we may see more of this. So I think it's a really important article. If you're going to allow people to fence, the most they should be able to fence is to the high tide mark, even according to state law. I just don't see how they're allowed to fence into the water. It just doesn't make any sense to me, but that's what happened. So,
just from a resilience standpoint, is kind of where I'm coming at from this. I know I've got a history of the birds, but that's not my point here today. So if there's going to be fencing, say, for a project where we do beach grass and we want to keep people out of that, and that goes down below the tide line, as a committee and sponsoring or advising on projects, we could end up, breaking the law effectively. That's where I'm coming at from this. And speaking as one who's already trying to get a project like this off the ground, I'm kind of worried that, if we have to do a kind of fenced off area for, say, a mitigation project, we could just be in trouble.
Right.
But where would you be mitigating below high tide?
In very, very thin areas.
Ian's question was, where would we be mitigating below high tide? Yeah.
And I get your point. My contention is that the proprietors / which is the select board would have the ability to give you that right. We have the ability right now, in my opinion, to say no dogs on the beach, certain beaches. We have that. If we own it and we allow the use for the public and have traditionally allowed it, we can also disallow it. So that's the. But we don't. That hasn't all been worked out yet. But that's kind of how we've looked at it for 100 years. There are things here on Nantucket. The state, you're not allowed to go and collect seaweed on Nantucket. You can collect seaweed because of a court case. Who would have thought? So there's, we have differences. So
Well,
Can
just to build on Matt's point, back in the 50s and 60s, I'm not trying to date myself, there was no concept of private ownership of beaches anywhere on the island. It was marvelous.
Can I ask a question, though? This article, and maybe this isn't the forum for it, but no person shall, without a valid permit, place an obstruction. Who would issue that permit?
So when it came to the discussions, so this is kind of an older iteration of the article. I had two really big problems, but this is only coming out from the bird point of view initially. So we shopped around to try and figure out, well, who would it be Concom? Would it be, say, Select Board, or it could be anyone? So I think later iterations of this ended up removing the requirement for a permit. Then it also added an exemption for protected species. which would include not only birds but marine mammals, say in the case of a stranding, or say a seal haul-out site. Right. But that's kind of getting kind of the more ecological side of it, and I'd really like to keep this discussion more to the coastal resilience side of things.
Well, because I liked the idea that there was that without a valid permit component of that now, depending on who the board was. But like, because for resiliency issues or for like, there would be a avenue to apply for, whether it's, resiliency issues, construction, the ecological issues or anything.
Yeah, if that stayed in, I would say it would be the proprietors, which is the select board, would issue it would issue that. It would be my opinion if that stayed in, but we're not.
Rick, did you have a comment here that you wanted to add?
Just so we understand, I think there's a negative recommendation from the Finance Committee on this, and the sponsors in general, I'm not speaking for all of them specifically, I think are perfectly willing if this is passed over at town meeting or tabled in some fashion, because there were a number of questions, and I think there's a fair amount of misunderstanding. And you can tell from your discussion, it's a topical, important issue. And I think it's good that we've raised it, but it needs to develop more before it really comes back to town meeting. So.
Thank you, Rick. Any further discussion on town meeting articles? Okay. Any members of the public who had some other comment they wanted to bring to the committee today? No, seeing none.
Mary?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And please give us your name too.
Hi, Taylor Donovan. I was just wondering if something that the committee has maybe considered in the past or is considering going forward, and maybe it's related to the article or the document you were looking at before, but maybe not, is something, or stormwater management in terms of like infrastructure. Because going forward, obviously sea level rise is a pertinent issue and very pressing, but if we have like more frequent and more severe storms, and maybe it's just an impact of rainwater inundating storm drains and outflow pipes and things like that, maybe more inland where the coastal area wouldn't be the only ones affected. Is that something that you would be looking to like provide recommendations for builders and contractors and the town in general? And
we had the same question 4 or 5 months ago, and I think the answer is there is a stormwater management plan in development, and it's under the DPW more than under us. Yeah. Okay.
oh, thank you.
But thank you for bringing that up.
Would there be a point that we could make, this committee could make recommendations to that plan, or is that too cross committees?
We did note that last time that we'd like to have Rob McNeil update us on the progress of that plan. I think it would be at least good for us to review it before it's final so that we can have input if needed.
So just to speak to that point,
Yeah.
after the last meeting, I did, as I was asked, and sent Rob an email asking if he was available to come speak at a future meeting, and I have not yet had a response. Sorry.
But it's not forgotten.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to other business. I did attend the Housing Advisory Trust meeting that was right after our meeting on February 18th, because they were reviewing the recommendations for the Housing First, which was last year's $20 million town article, to just appropriate money to buy houses. And then the question was assigned to them, well, how do we decide which houses to buy? And they had developed criteria for evaluation, and they had also developed criteria for information requested. And nothing in that was really taking into account coastal resilience issues. So I offered to their committee that in their request for information, they should ask, is the property currently in a FEMA flood zone, and is the property currently experiencing erosion? And added the caveat that neither one of those would necessarily be a criteria for elimination, but they are something that would require mitigation. And so I just made that point to them. So I wanted to bring that to this committee. I took the plunge. I went to another committee meeting and I gave a coastal resilience perspective, and it was well received, which was nice.
I mean, that's very good.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's not just erosion or sea level. It's going to be the expanding wetlands, and it's the people sort of look at what's happening on Brant Point already. I mean, I think that's going to happen in more areas, so.
And then the INM reported, and Matt, you might be able to give us more information on the select board's decision about the yard sale program from last Wednesday.
It really was, I don't know if it's a decision, but we had a couple of properties, Low Beach Road, that the town wanted to sell all 3 sides of the property in the yard sale program. The bids had gone through, and I opposed them, and I've been worried about whether we're taking into account, future uses and getting one big beach permits or, licenses, whatever, on a lot of these issues. And I think, because I think what's happening is the yard sales themselves are initiated by individuals, I think, more than they are a program where we're looking at one area and saying, okay, this is the area we want to do. And so, so it ended up being a 2-2 vote with myself and Rita opposed, and so it'll come back up. It'll probably be voted and approved, but I think what hopefully happens from it is that we will review the yard sale and start looking at, public access a little closer, whether they have any, whether those properties have any value to the town for resiliency or for, sort of storm surge or for, marshes to expand or anything like that, because why would we sell something and turn it into a green lawn that should have been kept as, 10,000 square feet of, to take water in. So I think that those issues, I think, will come up a little more as we move along. But it was an interesting conversation because it was just sort of, Rita and I at least are looking at it differently and sort of.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah.
What you said, it was kind of tabled because of the tie vote. When do you think it will come up again?
Oh, probably fairly soon. I don't think it's this week. No, it's not this week because I've looked at this week, but probably fairly soon. And my guess is it will pass. And it's low beach. There's tons of beach in between those properties and all the way down to the water. I asked the representatives, the lawyers for the 2 owners, geez, would you throw one big beach easements on it? I'll vote for it if you do that. And at first they were like, oh, we could do that. And then they thought, well, no, we can't because that wasn't how it was presented in the vote. So when it was put as an RFP, it didn't include terms like that. So you can't add those terms now. So what's happening with this program, it happens a lot of things, but there's a expectation built on the part of the homeowners or the proponents, because they walk in and they say, I want this and I want to participate in the program and I want to get this property next to mine to do whatever, to make more lawn, to build another bedroom or 2 or whatever they need it for, to increase the value of my property. So they go in, and once it goes through the process, a lot of times it'll go to town meeting, and when people have concerns, what you hear is nothing to see, the select board will take care of it, when it goes to disposition. And then it gets to us and and isn't it disposition yet? And we're told, don't worry, do that later. And then it gets to the very end and I say, well, here are my concerns. And they say, well, it's too late because all these things have already happened. And so we have to improve the process so that it isn't too late if there's a real concern. One that we're going to have coming up that might this group might be interested in is James Street, which has been something that's been sort of knocking about for about 20 years. And, Rick's theory on it is, why don't we keep it and license back to the homeowners? Why are we going to sell it? If we end up needing that, A, it's access that a lot of the neighbors nearby use, and B, it could end up being a swale, or it could end up being somewhere where you have to run a pipe, or who knows, and then we'd have to get it back once we've sold it for, short dollars. So there's a lot of, there's more, it's pretty complicated, so.
Thank you, Matt.
Okay.
Any other business? No, okay. As always, if any committee members have suggestions for items for the agendas coming up, feel free to send them to Vince and to me. And other than that, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Matt, second, Pete. And we'll count off Fritz.
Fritz McClure, aye.
Golding, aye.
Mary Longacre, aye.
Sarah Boyce, aye.
Jen Carberg, aye.
Peter Brace, aye.
And Gary?
Aye.
Thank you, everyone. The meeting is adjourned.